Before we begin today's episode, I want to share something that just happened this morning, something that illustrates exactly what we're about to discuss. As some of you know, I record these episodes on the weekend and then they air later on Substack and YouTube. This recording is being completed on Sunday, February 8th, 2026. In our Saturday episode that just premiered, we examined how the Wilson administration manufactured consent for World War I. We talked about the Creel Committee. We talked about the propaganda posters, the Hun with the bloody hands, the ape carrying the helpless woman. We talked about the 4 Minutemen, 75,000 volunteers delivering patriotic speeches in movie theaters across America. We talked how that shaped public opinion 4 minutes at a time. That was 1917. The tools have changed, but the technique has not. This morning, I woke to find a post on X that had garnered over 100,000 views in just over 8 hours. The original post was over 600,000 views, close to 700,000 views in that same time period. So we're close to 1 million views just on that one post and repost, and I'm sure there were others. I didn't go in to look for it. But the post featured the faces of Donald Trump, President Trump, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, and Vice President J.D. Vance superimposed onto the 1980s band Flock of Seagulls from their music video, the song Iran. And now you guys have that stuck in your head. I'm sorry, I apologize for that. But in this video, the lyrics were changed. Instead of Iran, it became, of course, Bomb Iran. And then images of American bombers have been inserted throughout the video. I'll post that here so you guys can see snippets of that video as it goes through. The post is utterly pro-war, and it's popular. 100,000 views in 8 hours on a reshare. As I said, the original post already has 700,000 views since last night. Shared, liked, celebrated. This is what I want you to hold in your head as we proceed through today's episode. We have a public that clamors for the killing of other peoples. Not reluctantly accepts it as a tragic necessity, but celebrates it, sets it to music, makes it entertainment. War, it's not a sporting event. It's not something that we celebrate our team's ability. Of course, we, the United States, of course we can dominate in war. We have a $1.5 trillion annual budget. We have created the ability to take productive assets from taxpayers to transfer to the military-industrial complex like no other country in the history of the world. So yes, we can dominate if you think of it like a sporting event, but it's not. And how did we get here? Does our ability to bomb anywhere on the globe at any time with minimal risk to American lives remove us, the public, from what bombing actually does? Does the distance, the screens, the joysticks, the press releases insulate us from the reality that bombs destroy? Bombs kill. And that along with whatever targets we intend to hit, innocent people die as well. We have a term for that: collateral damage. A term designed to minimize, to sanitize, to make palatable what would otherwise be unbearable. Collateral damage does not sound like child buried to death in the rubble. It does not sound like family incinerated at a wedding. It sounds like a line item, an accounting entry, a regrettable but acceptable cost. The Creel Committee understood that to mobilize a nation for war, you must first make war acceptable, even desirable. You must transform killing from tragedy to triumph. You must make the enemy less than human and make violence against them not merely justifiable, but righteous. Today, we don't need the Creel Committee. We have social media. We have algorithms that amplify outrage. We have viral content that spreads faster than any 4-minute man could speak. We have a public so conditioned to violence as entertainment that Bomb Iran, set to an 80s pop song, can collect hundreds of thousands of views before I finish my morning coffee. This is the world we'll examine in this episode.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
As of February 1st, 2026, the United States conducted its 27th airstrike in Somalia this year. 27 airstrikes in 32 days. That's more airstrikes than the entire year of 2024, more than half of what President Biden authorized in his entire 4-year term, in just over 1 month. In 2025, the United States conducted 124 airstrikes in Somalia. That's 12 times the number conducted under the Biden administration the year before. More than Biden, Obama, and Bush administrations combined. I've asked this before in a previous episode, but outside of our audience, outside of the folks that follow Dave DeCamp on antiwar.com, how many Americans know this? There was no congressional debate. There was no declaration of war. There was no national discussion about whether we should be bombing Somalia at a rate that would produce 300 airstrikes this year if continued. The bombs fall, AFRICOM issues a press release, and American life continues undisturbed. In 1918, the essayist Randolph Bourne wrote us 7 words that have echoed through every American war since. War is the health of the state. Bourne understood something that Americans had learned in the trenches of France, that war transforms the relationship between citizen and state, that emergency justifies power that peace would never permit, that once government expands to meet a crisis, it rarely contracts when the crisis ends. Today, we live in Bourne's world, a world where the emergency never ends, where the war powers never expire, where the bombs fall in places most Americans cannot find on a map, and all without the informed consent of the people whose government drops them and who pays for them. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 5, part B of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, the Perpetual Emergency. This episode corresponds to Article 5 of our written series, War is the Health of the State, published this previous Sunday on our Substack page and with a follow-up podcast on Saturday. As always, this contemporary application episodes connects the historical material, in this case, World War I's transformation of Americans' relationship to war, propaganda, and dissent, to our present moment. What we'll find today is the patterns established in 1917 and 1918 have not disappeared. They have become permanent features of American governance. Let us begin. Let me continue with what America is actually doing right now, as I speak, in a country most Americans never think about. The United States has been conducting military operations in Somalia for nearly 2 decades. Since 2007, American forces have been engaged in what AFRICOM calls advise, assist, and accompany missions. Since 2017, those operations have expanded dramatically. The stated enemy is al-Shabaab, an al-Qaeda affiliate, and ISIS Somalia, the local branch of the Islamic State. The stated mission is counterterrorism. The stated justification is the 2001 authorization for use of military force. A law passed 3 days after September 11th to authorize force against those responsible for those attacks. The authorization is now being used to bomb an organization that did not exist when it was written, to kill people that weren't even born at that time, in a country that had nothing to do with September 11th, nearly a quarter of a century after the attacks it was designed to address. Just that on its own, that we have not received any further authorization from Congress, from the people's representatives, should cause pause. This is what the permanent warfare state looks like. Legal authorities that never expire, missions that never end, enemies that multiply rather than diminish, all conducted with minimal congressional oversight and virtually no public awareness. Let me give you the numbers because the numbers reveal what rhetoric conceals. Under President Obama, the United States conducted approximately 42 airstrikes in Somalia over 8 years. Under President Biden, approximately 35 airstrikes over 4 years. Under President Trump's first term, 203 airstrikes in 4 years, with a peak of 63 in 2019. At the time, the most ever in a single year. In 2025 alone, President Trump's first year in his second term, 124 airstrikes, nearly double the previous record. More than Obama and Biden's entire tenures combined. And in the first 32 days of 2026, 27 more airstrikes. That puts us on a pace for over 300 this year. There's been no congressional vote authorizing this escalation. There's been no national debate. There has been, as far as I can determine, virtually no mainstream media coverage. Again, thank you to Dave DeCamp and antiwar.com for their coverage. But beyond that, you rarely hear about it. AFRICOM stopped providing casualty estimates. So we don't even know how many people these strikes have killed. Combatants, civilians, anyone. The command no longer tells us, and apparently no one in a position of authority cares enough to demand that they do. Now, I want to be fair about the stated rationale. General Michael Langley, commander of AFRICOM, has argued that ISIS Somalia poses a direct threat to the American homeland. The organization has allegedly been planning attacks. Their leader, Abdul Kahir Mumin, sorry for the pronunciation, is reportedly the global caliph of ISIS, operating from caves in the Golis Mountains. These may be genuine concerns. I do not have access to the classified intelligence, and of course, I'm not in a position to assess the operational merits of specific strikes. But here's what I can say. The American people have a right to know when their government is conducting military operations at unprecedented scale. And Congress has a constitutional obligation to authorize the use of military force. Congress can receive those classified briefings. Congress is our representatives that we empower to authorize this. And the press has a responsibility to inform the public about what their government is doing or what they're not doing in their name. So none of these things are happening. This is Bourne's insight made manifest. war has become so normalized, so administrative, so disconnected from democratic accountability that the American government can triple its bombing campaign in a foreign country and it simply does not even register as news. The machinery of war runs, the press release issues, and we, the citizen, in whose name this is done, learn nothing, question nothing, consent to nothing. In Article 5, we examined how America's entry into World War I was shaped by financial entanglement. How J.P. Morgan's loans to the Allies created a constituency for intervention. How the House of Morgan stood to lose hundreds of millions if Germany won. And how economic interest had nothing to do with American security drove the nation toward war. It's a funny thing, even Alexander Hamilton knew this. He knew that by putting yourself in debt, you obligate the creditor. Britain, by putting themselves in debt to these banks, obligated our interests as creditors into a war that otherwise we would not have had interest. That's something to think about. But today, the financial constituency for war has become institutionalized. It's not hidden. It's not even controversial. It's simply the way things work. Let me give you some numbers on this too. Between 2020 and 2024, the 5 largest defense contractors received $771 billion in federal contracts. $771 billion in federal contracts. To put that in context, when we talked about the length of World War I, 1914 to 1918, the amount of money in today's dollars that were credited to the Allies in that time period, for World War I, to that point, the bloodiest, most horrific war in the history of mankind, we indebted $40 billion, which is a tremendous amount. But in the last 5 years, 2020 to 2024, our defense contractors received $771 billion in federal contracts. And again, that $40 billion that I was talking about, that was adjusted for inflation. So those are apples to apples numbers. Are we in another world war that I didn't know about? Lockheed Martin got $313 billion. RTX, formerly Raytheon, $145 billion. General Dynamics, $116 billion. Boeing, $115 billion. Northrop Grumman, $81 billion. Those are not abstract numbers. And of course, if those stocks are in your portfolio, your 401k campaign, are you actually rooting now for the war state because you're financially set to benefit? These aren't abstract numbers. They represent jobs, shareholders, communities, political donations, and lobbying operations. In 2024 alone, the defense industry employed approximately 950 registered lobbyists and spent $157 million on lobbying activities. That's the investment. $157 million to pull back over $700 billion. These companies have facilities in nearly every state. They are major employers in key congressional districts. Their executives cycle through the Pentagon and back through politely what we call the revolving door. Their contributions flow to members of the armed services committees. Their priorities become America's priorities. And I want to just talk about behind the curtain, a little bit in the weeds, the politics there. There's a reason it doesn't come on the floor of Congress to vote on these things. And that reason is because it doesn't come out of committee, and that committee is often the Armed Services Committee. So let's recognize where those contributions go and why we don't see it come to a floor vote. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not suggesting conspiracy. I'm not claiming that defense contractors control American foreign policy through some hidden mechanism. What I'm saying is simpler and I think more troubling. There is a permanent constituency for military spending. There are institutions whose existence depends on threat, whose prosperity depends on conflict, whose growth depends on the perpetuation of enemies. With $771 billion flows to 5 companies over 5 years, those companies have an interest in ensuring that the money keeps flowing. When 950 lobbyists walk the halls of Congress, they're not arguing for peace. When executives move from corporate boardrooms to the Pentagon offices and back again, they carry with them the assumptions about threats, about priorities, about solutions that they, perhaps coincidentally, align with corporate interests. This is the industrialization of what Bourne observed. The state at war becomes dependent on war. The economy shapes itself around military production. The political system adapts to military priorities. And gradually, imperceptibly, war becomes not an emergency, but a condition. Not a departure from normal, but normal itself. Consider what this means in practice. In December 2025, the United States approved an $11 billion arms package to Taiwan, the largest in history. That brings the total backlog of approved arms sales to Taiwan to $32 billion. In January 2026, the United States approved $6.67 billion in new arms sales to Israel, on top of the billions already committed. The United States has committed over $175 billion to Ukraine since February 2022. Each of these decisions may be defensible on its own terms. I'm not arguing that any particular arms sale is wrong. What I am observing is the pattern. There's always another enemy. There's always another ally that needs weapons. There's always another crisis that requires military hardware. And there are always institutions, companies, lobbyists, think tanks, consultants that benefit from each transaction. The machine runs, the money flows, the wars continue. And rarely does anyone ask, is this making Americans more free or more governed?
I warned against entangling alliances. They did not listen. Now you can trace exactly how it happened.
The Consequential Actions podcast is on YouTube. Subscribe and follow each series from the very beginning. Principled debate requires participation. Like the episodes. Leave a comment. Join the discussion.
Every series is organized as a playlist, from General Welfare to The New Leviathan to Empire of Liberty. Begin at the beginning.
In Article 5, we examined how the Wilson administration manufactured consent for World War I. Wellington House in Britain, the Creel Committee in America, these were the first modern propaganda operations, designed to transform public opinion from heavy skepticism to enthusiasm. Enthusiasm for war most Americans initially wanted no part of. The techniques have changed, but the goal has not. Today, the manufacturing of consent operates through a network of think tanks, media outlets, and expert communities that frame the boundaries of acceptable debate. Again, this is not conspiracy. It is how institutions function. People who share assumptions about America's role in the world staff the institutions that shape American foreign policy. Alternative perspectives are not suppressed. They're simply not heard because they fall outside of the range of views that serious people should seriously consider. I'll talk more about this in a moment, but in a released email from the Jeffrey Epstein files, Epstein communicated about GOP candidates in previous elections. The one candidate he belittled as a dinkus, his words, was the one candidate who saw through all of this and whose message of anti-war and non-intervention was actually making headway. Ron Paul. Now consider the think tank ecosystem. The Atlantic Council, the Brookings Institution, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Council on Foreign Relations. These organizations produce the reports. They train the experts. And they provide talking heads that populate cable news and op-ed pages. Their funding comes from governments, corporations, and foundations with interest in a particular policy outcome. Their experts cycle through government positions and back. Their assumption about American primacy, alliance commitments, and threat perception become the baseline from which all debates proceed. Now, I'm not claiming these organizations are wrong about everything. Many produce valuable research. Many employ serious scholars. What I am observing is the structure. When the expert consensus on any issue is produced by institutions funded by those who benefit from a particular conclusion, we should be skeptical of that consensus. When the serious position on any controversy happens to align with institutional interest, we should ask whose interests are being served. Consider the language itself. We are told that America upholds the rules-based international order. But who made these rules? And who enforces them? The United States invaded Iraq in 2003 without Security Council authorization. Was that consistent with the rules-based order? The United States supports Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, which has produced the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Is that rules-based order in action? We're told that certain countries are adversaries and others are allies. But adversaries of what? And allies for what purpose? Saudi Arabia dismembers journalists. It remains an ally. Hungary elects a government we disapprove of. It becomes suspect. The categories seem less about values than about alignment with America's preferences at that time. We are told that American military presence provides stability. But stable for whom? The Middle East, where America has maintained massive military presence for decades? It does not seem notably stable. Afghanistan, where America maintained forces for 20 years, collapsed within weeks of our departure. The language itself forecloses debate. If American primacy is axiomatically good, if the rules-based order is by definition legitimate, if allies are automatically worthy and adversaries automatically threatening, then no argument against American intervention can ever gain traction. The conclusion is embedded in the premise. Let me offer a current example because this is a contemporary application. Let me offer a current example of how the narrative control operates, one that is unfolding as I speak. In November 2025, Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act. The vote was 427-1 in the House. It passed the Senate unanimously. President Trump even signed it on November 19th. The law required the Justice Department to release all files related to the investigation of Jeffrey Epstein within 30 days. I want to pause here and acknowledge something. I applaud Representatives Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna. a Republican and a Democrat, who spearheaded this legislation. They whipped bipartisan support. They structured the law to compel disclosure. They have continued to pressure the Department of Justice when it failed to comply fully. This is how congressional oversight should function. The Justice Department identified over 6 million potentially responsive pages. It released approximately 3.5 million, many heavily redacted. Representatives Massey and Khanna have disputed whether this constitutes compliance. A federal judge denied their request for a special master to oversee the release, though he acknowledged their legitimate concerns. And as of this weekend, members of Congress can now review unredacted files at the Justice Department starting tomorrow, Monday, February 10th. Now, here's where the propaganda analysis becomes relevant. Within days of the latest file release, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk announced an investigation into what he called possible links between Jeffrey Epstein and Russian intelligence services. Tusk provided no evidence. He offered no documentation. He simply announced that Poland would investigate whether Epstein was a Russian asset. Western media immediately amplified the question. Was Epstein working for Russia when he collected compromising material for the Kremlin? The story proliferated. Let me be clear about what we actually know, as distinguished from what is being speculated. The files do mention Russia thousands of times. Epstein apparently cultivated relationships with Russian officials and sought meetings with Vladimir Putin. This is documented. But here's what is also documented, and far more extensively. Epstein's connections to Israel's Mossad, his close relationship with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, his connections to figures like Robert Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell's father, whom Epstein himself wrote worked for the Mossad, his involvement with Carbine, an Israeli tech company. The circumstantial evidence of Israeli intelligence connections is substantial and has been reported by credible journalists. There's also the matter of former late Labor Secretary Alexander Acosta's reported statement that he was told to back off of the Epstein prosecution because Epstein belonged to intelligence. A statement that has never been fully adequately explained. There is speculation about CIA connections, French intelligence connections, connections to multiple agencies that have never been properly investigated. My job here is not to determine which speculation is correct. I do not know if Epstein worked for Russian intelligence, Israeli intelligence, American intelligence, or some combination. Without genuine congressional investigation of the actual intelligence community, investigations that have not occurred, all of this remains speculation. But I can observe the pattern. When files are released that might implicate powerful interest in multiple countries, the immediate focus shifts to Russia. The far more documented Israeli connections receive minimal mainstream coverage. The potential American intelligence connections are treated as conspiracy theory. The narrative channels in a particular direction, toward the enemy we already are primed to suspect, and away from allies we are conditioned to trust. I should also note something that's puzzled me throughout this affair. A multi-billionaire with connection to global leaders, heads of state, titans of finance and technology, apparently conducted substantial correspondence through Gmail, a free consumer email service. Encrypted platforms existed. Private servers with private domains seem far more fitting for an operation of this magnitude. Perhaps he simply preferred the Gmail interface? Perhaps. It's weird. My point is not to speculate. My point is to recognize the pattern, how propaganda has been leveraged in the past and could be applied to our current or future situation. when intelligence speculation becomes pretext for policy, when evidence is selectively amplified based on which adversary it implicates, and when the narrative forms before the investigation completes, we are watching manufacturing of consent in real time. In Article 5, we examined the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, laws that criminalized dissent against American involvement in World War I. Eugene Debs received 10 years in federal prison for a speech opposing the draft. Hundreds of Americans were prosecuted for expressing opposition to the war. The government's message was clear. In wartime, dissent is disloyalty. We do not have sedition persecutions today. What we have is perhaps more effective. A system of professional and social consequences that achieve similar results without inefficiencies of criminal trials. Consider what has happened on the American University campus over the past year. In 2025 and continuing into 2026, students who participated in protests related to the Gaza conflict have faced extraordinary consequences. Not criminal prosecution for violence, that would be unremarkable. Not discipline for disrupting classes, that might be defensible. No, what has happened is something different. Since January 2025, over 6,000 student visas have been revoked. Students have been detained. Students have been deported, not for criminal acts, but for political speech. Consider the case of Muhammad Khalil, a Columbia University student, a legal permanent resident, a Rhodes Scholar finalist. He participated in campus protest. He was detained by immigration authorities. His offense, as near as anyone can determine, was political activity the government disapproved of. The United Nations human rights experts have criticized these actions. Human Rights Watch has called for an end to what it describes as a sweeping effort to deport students for peaceful protest. The pattern is clear. International students who engage in political speech the administration dislikes can be expelled from the country. Let me be precise about what I am and am not claiming. I'm not claiming that every protest is justified. Far from it. I'm not claiming that disruption should not have consequences. I am not claiming that students who break laws should not face legal process. What I am observing is the mechanism, the power to revoke visas, to detain residents, to initiate deportation proceedings. These are administrative powers, not criminal powers. They require no conviction. They provide minimal due process. They can be deployed against disfavored speech in ways that criminal prosecution cannot. Eugene Debs had a trial. He had a jury. He could appeal. He became a martyr whose persecution helped turn public opinion. A student whose visa is revoked has none of these things. There is no public trial. There is no jury of peers. There is no martyrdom. Just a quiet removal from the country, a name expunged from campus rolls, and a message sent to others who might consider similar speech. This is what the new sedition looks like. Not prosecution, but process. Not conviction, but consequence. Not prison, but exile. The machinery of the national security state has found ways to achieve the goals of the Sedition Act without its legal vulnerabilities. Dissent is not criminalized. It is administratively disadvantaged. Opposition is not imprisoned. It is professionally destroyed. Speech is not formally suppressed. It is rendered dangerous enough that self-censorship achieves what censorship could not. Let me turn finally to where the permanent warfare state might lead us, to the tripwires that could trigger the next catastrophe. On Friday, February 6th, 2 days ago as I record this, the United States and Iran conducted indirect talks in Muscat, Oman. This was the first negotiation since the United States joined Israel's strike on the Iranian nuclear facilities last June. The Iranian foreign minister described the talks as a good start. President Trump called them very good. Both sides agreed to continue negotiations. But observe the context. The American delegation included Steve Witkoff, the president's special envoy, and Jared Kushner, his son-in-law. It also included Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of U.S. Central Command, in his dress uniform. Admiral Cooper is the most senior American military commander in the region. The aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln and its strike group are currently sailing in the Arabian Sea off the coast of Iran. On Friday evening, the same day as the talks, the U.S. military published photographs of the Lincoln carrier group with aircraft overhead, accompanied by the message, "Peace through strength." Also on Friday, the same day as the talks, the Trump administration announced new sanctions targeting 15 entities, 2 individuals, and 14 vessels linked to the Iranian oil trade. An Iranian diplomatic source told Reuters that Admiral Cooper's presence endangered the talks. Another warned that negotiations taking place under threat could impose strategic costs rather than advance them. Iran acknowledged very deep mistrust between the parties. They stated that negotiations must take place without tension and without threats. Iran rejected demands for zero enrichment and has refused to negotiate over its missile program or regional activities. On Thursday, the day before the talks, Iran test-launched one of its most advanced ballistic missiles. It was capable of reaching Israel and American bases across the region. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stated, "We are at the negotiating table, but we will not give up military power." This is diplomacy conducted in the shadow of force. The question is whether it will produce agreement or provide pretext for the military action that some in both governments may have already concluded is inevitable. On February 4th and 5th, this past Wednesday and Thursday, Ukrainian and Russian negotiators met in Abu Dhabi for the second round of the U.S. brokered peace talks since the war began nearly 4 years ago. There were some tangible results. Two sides exchanged 157 prisoners each, the first swap in 5 months. The United States and Russia agreed to reestablish high-level military-to-military dialogue for the first time since late 2021, before the invasion. But there was no understanding of the fundamental issues. Russia demands that Ukraine withdraw from areas of the Donbass still under Ukrainian control. Ukrainian demands for security guarantees that Moscow will not accept, and the status of Crimea and the occupied territories. And as the talks proceeded, Russia launched massive attacks on Ukraine's energy grid. On the day negotiations began, Russian forces struck energy infrastructure across the country. The message, as with Iran, was clear. We negotiate from strength, not weakness. President Zelensky disclosed this week that approximately 55,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed since the war began, the first official acknowledgement of the scale of losses. The actual number, including wounded and missing, is certainly far higher, nearly 2 million casualties across both sides by some estimates. Now I want to acknowledge the complexity here. Russia committed aggression. We've talked about that on previous episodes. Ukraine has a right to defend itself. There are genuine security concerns on both sides. But the question for Americans is different. What is the American interest in this conflict? How does it serve American security to commit over $175 billion to a proxy war that shows no sign of ending? What is the end game for us? And who decided that this was the path America would follow? Because it was not decided by Congress, and it was not debated by the American people. And it is not clear that any exit strategy exists. What connects Somalia, Iran, and Ukraine is the pattern that American military engagement proceeds without meaningful democratic deliberation. That it generates its own institutional momentum that creates constituencies for continuation, and that offers no clear path to conclusion. We bomb Somalia at unprecedented rates and no one notices. We negotiated with Iran while positioning carrier groups and imposing sanctions and call it diplomacy. We fund a proxy war in Ukraine without ever defining victory or acknowledging that victory may not be possible. In each case, the machinery runs, the money flows, the experts opine, and the American people, whose sons and daughters serve, whose taxes pay, whose security is supposedly at stake, are neither consulted nor informed. This is the perpetual emergency that Bourne warned us about, a condition in which war is not declared, peace is not made, and the state continues to expand its powers under the justification of threats that never quite resolve. In 1918, Randolph Bourne did not live to see the end of the war he opposed. He died of the influenza pandemic at age 32, with his essay, The State, unfinished. But his insight survived, that war transforms the relationship between citizen and state, that emergency justifies what normalcy would not permit, that once government expands to meet a crisis, it rarely contracts when the crisis ends. What Bourne could not have foreseen is that the emergency would become permanent, that America would find itself in a condition of perpetual war, perpetual threat, perpetual expansion of state power, with no end in sight and no mechanism for democratic accountability. Today, we bomb countries without declaring war. We fund proxy conflicts without exit strategies. We suppress dissent through administrative mechanisms rather than criminal prosecution. We're not informed of what our government does in our name, and when the information emerges, we do not even know how to process it. The founders understood something that we have forgotten, that free peoples require government to protect their rights, but that government itself poses the greatest threat to those rights. That is why they insisted on declarations of war. That is why they feared standing armies. That is why they warned against foreign entanglements. They were not pacifists. They understood that war is sometimes necessary. They fought a revolution. But they also understood that war changes things, that it concentrates power, that it suppresses dissent, that it creates interest in its own perpetuation. They tried to design a system that would make war difficult to begin and easy to end. We have reversed that design. We have made war easy to begin, a press release from AFCOM, a presidential authorization, a vote that is never taken, and impossible to end. I saw a tweet from Lindsey Graham this morning claiming that Congress should have to approve any settlement that's made between the U.S. and Iran. I think that's quite ironic and quite rich, because he certainly doesn't want Congress to approve any bombings in Iran, which is the exact message of the Constitution. We need to declare war. He inverted it. In a tweet, he explicitly said Congress should approve any ceasefire agreement, any plan to halt the escalation of war. But of course, Congress shouldn't be involved if the war actually escalates. Crazy. As we end today, I just wanted to bring that point to bear. And upcoming, we will examine Sykes-Picot, Balfour, and the creation of the modern Middle East. This is a very important episode to me. I hope you tune in. I hope you enjoy that episode. It's very interesting and covers a lot of history that most Americans might have missed. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 5, part B of Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements, from the Founders to the Forever Wars on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. Here you'll find our written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at jkelly for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.